morning, everyone. Good morning, Unity. So I feel the need, just in case you actually read your bulletin, I feel the need to point out that I am not Duke, and I will not be talking about what Duke did on his summer vacation. So just want to make that clear, but I will be talking about Duke. So that's good news for some of you. So I want to start by sharing why Duke is not here today. He sent me a note at around 12-something yesterday saying that a friend of his, actually whom he has known for over 50 years, made their transition. And so last minute, of course, Duke got up and today is driving out to see to the memorial service and to also be with other friends that he's known, since his high school days. So you might imagine that my immediate response to his text was to have my heart, go out to Duke. And my first response was to send my condolences, but of course this was just over text. But I happened to be on the move from home, and I was about to actually come into Unity Temple. Again, this was just yesterday. And so I said, hey, Duke, are you there at the temple? Because if so, I'd like to just come see you. And he said, yeah, I'm here on the back porch. I said, great. So I kind of hurried over to the temple, and I showed up, and there he was, as he said he was, sunbathing on the back porch of Unity Temple. And so I noticed, fortunately, that there was a chair right next to where he was sitting. I noticed how he was sitting and how he was facing the playground area as opposed to the street. Sitting out there, you can look either way, but facing that way, the sun was on his face, and there was just this glow, right? But I looked at his face, I'm checking it out to see if he's okay. And I noticed he's just not as chipper as he normally is. So I pulled up the chair, asked if I could sit down next to him, and I sat down, and I asked him about this friend, and we talked a little bit about that. And then just after 7 minutes, just this quiet sitting next to ness, he turns to me, looks at my feet, and says, nice shoes. I was wearing these flip-flops from Colorado that I bought, these suede shoes with this animal print on it, very casual compared to how I usually dress. And of course I smiled, but I didn't smile because of the compliment. I smiled because I thought, there's Duke, because this man loves shoes. And most of his shoes come from Europe, right? And they're very special, but I noticed that one thing about him is that he notices the shoes that people wear, and he pays attention to the shoes that he wears. And I thought, to me, this is a part of who Duke is to me, and it's an endearing quality. And it made me think about how the people we know through these sort of patterns or behaviors that are usually quirky, right? But sort of unique to them, a certain pattern of behavior that is when you see it, you're like, oh, this is them. And when they're not showing up in that way, you wonder if something's wrong. If those of you who know my husband Victor know that if he's not bubbling like this when he meets you, something's dreadfully wrong. Because that's his nature, that's his way of being in the world. And so I invite you to just take a moment right now and consider in your life someone you hold dear. Consider a habit or pattern that they have that's quirky, unique to them. And when you see it, you're like, oh, this is that person, my beloved. Right? What are the patterns? I have a friend whose 9-year-old son named Alex has this habit where he has an internal clock where once an hour he will get up from whatever he's doing, she says, whether he's playing with Legos or video games or playing outside, he will stop what he's doing and run to his mama for a hug. On the hour, she says. And then I have another friend whose uncle has this thing about wintergreen mints in his car. And you just know, throughout childhood, if you come into this uncle's car, you're gonna get offered a wintergreen mint. And that was his thing. That was the thing that they do, right? So what are the things that people do, these habits that are so endearing? And then as we reflect on these things, one example that cracks me up. Christopher, who is our building manager, do you notice how he wears visors everywhere he goes in the building? And I was thinking about the song that Jerome sang, and I'm like, because there's sunshine in this building, clearly, that he wears a visor throughout the building, but that's Christopher, right? So these are the kinds of things that are endearing to us. But how many of us also are aware of patterns or behaviors in ourselves or in other people that are not so endearing? These are habits of behavior or habits of mind, habits of conduct, habits of our own mind that not only are not endearing, but that can often harm us. Some of them, on a lighter level, simply are inconveniences, or they can embarrass us. One example is the fact that for some bizarre reason, whenever I walk into Duke's office, I have to pee. Like I have this Pavlovian response, and I have a theory about it, which is that, I'm in my office and I'm working hard, and I'm not paying attention to whether I need to eat or whatever, and then the moment I take a break. But every time I go into his office, you know how it goes. In his office, you walk in, there's his office. If you walk through, there's the bathroom. Nowadays, when I walk in, he just points me right through, all the way to that. There you go. Go pee first, Nhien. So there's some habits that are a little embarrassing. But then there are other habits we have that are actually destructive to ourselves and destructive to others. And of course, at the extreme, these habits are addictions in our lives, addictions to alcohol, to drugs. Some of us, it's addiction to rage, or maybe some of us grew up with someone with an addiction to rage, that this is a pattern of being. So today, I'd like for us to consider the habits that we have had throughout our lives. I'd like to take a moment first to consider and celebrate perhaps a habit, compulsion, or addiction that you have had, that you have overcome. And if you feel courageous, I might even ask for a raise of hands right now to say, is there a negative habit in your life that you have actually overcome over these years? If so, I invite you to raise your hand. Consider that. That's quite an accomplishment. If we start, as we will here today, go into actually how challenging it can be to turn around the force of the habits in our lives. But then I invite you now to also consider, what habit might you have today, or pattern of being, that is actually hurting you? Maybe it's not one extreme thing, but a pattern of things over time, like procrastination, to the point where you want this job, but for some reason you can't even get yourself to fill out your resume, right? Procrastination. Well, maybe some of us are just chronically late to things, and that might not seem, troublesome in and of itself, but when over time it starts to undermine your relationship with others, right? Because they don't feel respected by you, or that they can rely on you. And it's not like you feel like you do this consciously or deliberately. It just happens. Or you might be chronically late to your therapist's appointment, right? Like for some reason you're on time to everything else, but there's a little bit of when it comes to that. So what other habits? Overeating. How about undereating? How about overspending? Some of us have a habit of collecting things. That's the term I'll use. Some people might call it hoarding. But we're collectors. We have the sense that, we're not going to quite be secure, and maybe, just maybe, we will need that thing. And so we stuff it into a box, put it away in the basement, forget that we have it, and buy 5 more of the same thing, we have this compulsive way of collecting things. Some of us are maybe even less conscious of the habits we have, where we're the naysayers. We don't know why people won't tell us their dreams, but we might, if we pay close attention, start to notice that the moment someone says something positive to us, the first thing out of our mouths, without us even wanting to, is what could go wrong about that thing? Or maybe to criticize that thing. I know I've tended in my life to have a habit of being critical, with this idea that if I was critical, I could help the person fix the matter, right? So it was like with a helpful orientation, but I didn't realize I was shutting people down through this habit, right, without even thinking. You just respond like that. So I invite you to consider today something either huge that you would like to stop doing that doesn't serve your highest good, or maybe even something little. Just one small switcheroo that when I go home on Sundays, exhausted as a minister, I will not take that bag of chips to the couch, and finish it off as I binge watch Netflix, right? That maybe that doesn't actually serve my highest good, that maybe I can take a baby step toward that, and I might take a bag of carrots, because, you want to do something, you'll be chewing on something. But so we can take a look at that. So one thing about habits that I want to say, in the way that Unity could be different from other churches, is that there's a lot of this, you shouldn't do that. That's a bad thing, and therefore you shouldn't do that. And I don't know about you, but when people do that to me, I just want to do that more. Like, I don't have no incentive or reason or rationale behind not wanting to do that when people should on me in that way, when religion shoulds on me in that way. And so I invite you to consider this line that's often talked about in Unity, which is that we are not punished for our sins. It's not like there's some God up there going, you did that bad thing and you're going to be punished. We are not punished for our sins. We are punished by them. That our engagement in this conduct from a perspective that doesn't hold our highest good and the highest good of all actually undermines our capacity to live our divine or Christ potential, to live our fullest lives. And so the invitation to letting go of even just one little negative habit that keeps us from living our fullest and freest lives is about how it can serve us in living, as again Jerome in his words said, living in the kingdom of heaven, which is a state of consciousness and being that is not in the future, but right here and right now, living our fullest lives because we're willing to release this. But to be willing to release it takes this acknowledgement, right, first, that it can be really, really challenging to change a habit. And there's a great story about a teacher who tried to explain to children, her students, how habits are formed. And she took this very thin piece of thread, and she had one of her students hold his wrists together like this, and she took the thread and she tied it around his wrists, and she said, "Break the thread." And the student went, poof, broke the thread. And she said, "That is when you do something once." Then she did it again, tied the thread around twice around this boy's wrist. And she said, "Break the thread." And he's still pretty strong. He went, poof, he broke the thread. And then she did it 3 times around the wrist, and 4 times, and then 5 times. And each time she tied this thin little thread around his wrist, it got harder, more difficult to break the thread. The repetition of these patterns in our lives does this to us, right? How do we break through this? Well, that's one thing I want to explore with you today. Wayne Dyer, the late Wayne Dyer, said, "You leave old habits behind by starting out with the thought, I release the need for this in my life." So we begin always in consciousness. How many of us have kept telling ourselves and trying to apply willpower to be like, I'm going to be on time next time, and then we're not. We do the same thing over and over again. When if we look into consciousness, his words, I release the need for this in my life. You might begin by saying, well, I don't need to be late, right? What does he mean? I release the need for this in my life. I don't need to yell at my children. The idea is that we go behind the behavior and consider what is the need, the valid need, however misguided the behavior is, that is driving this. Is it possible that I reach for that bag of potato chips to numb out and medicate because maybe I'm exhausted and I don't want to feel it, and I don't know that I have the capacity to feel it? So the habit is designed to support me numbing out, because the need is the false belief that I can't handle what I'm feeling, and so I need to numb out. The root of much of our addiction, right? What if there is an unconscious need, to avoid growth? And that's what is actually driving us not making it to our therapist appointment on time. If we could get back of why it is that we turn to that behavior, then we have a deeper starting point than just slapping our own hand and saying, don't do that again. So I invite you to consider in this habit that you might be considering budging, freeing up, loosening from the grip of that thread here this week. What deep in you, what unconscious or conscious belief is really driving it? What need are you fulfilling by doing it? A need for comfort? A sense of security. And when you know that, you can begin to budge. The second thing that supports us, even neuroscientists talk about this, is tell a friend. So we start by being willing to release a habit. And the second thing we do is we invite community into this. And it's said that when we say, hey, I'm going to stop my habit of caretaking everyone to the detriment of my own health. If I tell my friends this, and then I have a triumph around the fact that, oh, I set my boundary, I said no to someone just once. We get to celebrate it. And then the positive affirmation within ourselves, as well as from that around us, starts to reinforce another behavior, an alternate way of being. And that relates to a third way that we can start to loosen up the grip of the habits that hurt our lives. And that is that we can invite a positive habit into the picture. My former minister from Unity in Marin, he had this big thing about wanting to get fit and lose weight. But he said if I only focused on the food I couldn't have, that wasn't working at all for me. What I was focusing on was the vision of what I wanted and the behaviors that would replace that. Because what happens if we don't have an affirmative, positive behavior that replaces that? We have what's known as cross addiction, right? We just go to another unhealthy, addictive pattern. And so the invitation is to consider, what could I do positively instead of the other thing that I was doing? Like the example of eating carrots instead of eating chips. They're crunchy. They're close. Not quite the same, but they're a step. And that's all we need to do is take a step and then take another and then take another. We don't have to leap over from doing this all the time to not doing this. We take a step. And so the invitation is to come into a beingness that allows you to live a more vibrant life rather than a life that is numbed out or medicated through the habits of being. Related to the idea of numbing out and medication, Some of the neuroscientists, maybe with a little more negative spin, it's like, we develop habits, they say, because we're lazy. And I like to think it's because we're efficient. You know, a better way of framing it, I think. But what happens, right? We're efficient, which is the brain is tasked with so many activities in a day, right? So how does it cope with it? Well, some of the things that it's like, oh, we do this all the time, so let's go on route. You know, if you drive to the same location every day, the system goes on route and goes unconscious, develops a habit so that your brain doesn't have to consciously think about that every day, becomes more efficient and effective. So there's a good reason for why our habits get stored in the way that they do. And that's why we also have to do a discipline of making that unconscious pattern conscious, telling friends about this new pattern of behavior that we'd like, deepening into the understanding of releasing the need behind and the fear behind why we don't do it. Charles Fillmore, co-founder of the Unity movement, said, "Right here and now, the great work of character building is to be done. And whoever neglects present opportunities looking forward to a future heaven for better conditions is pulling right away from the kingdom of heaven within themselves." Right here and now, the great work of character building is to be done. But of course, we don't have to always take that in a heavy way. A part of how we can support ourselves in this journey is to kind of lighten up about it. And with that, I'm reminded of a saying. Have you heard that saying? Someone tells you, "I never make the same mistake twice. I make it 5 or 6 times just to be sure of it," right? And that reminds me of what happened last week. Who was here for Marnie Voss last week? The amazing comedian. Yeah. So Marnie came because she's actually on the Womankind slate of speakers, and she was coming to meet with me to talk about what she was going to do for Womankind. Well, what was really cool is that she didn't speak just at this service at 10:30. She spoke also at our Unite 12:15 service. And so I got to sit with her. And what happened is, in the beginning, when our platform assistant announced her and announced all these wonderful things about her, just to give her a round of applause and welcome her into the service, she thought it was her time to get up. So she was sitting down there with me, you know, and ran up to the stage and stood there. And the platform assistant was like, you know, because it wasn't her time to speak yet. So she just stood there for a moment. And then she smiled and she ran back down, and she sat down next to me, and kind of loudly she said, "I did that in the 10:30 a.m. service also," you know? And she's like, "Oh," but just her humor around it. And so she's sitting next to me, and then finally it's her time to get up again. And the platform assistant's finished, and I'm like nudging her, and she's like, "Whatever." Like she's not going up. And for like 5 minutes, she wouldn't get up. But, you know, this is her way of making light of the situation and making fun of her own mistake. And I just really cherish that, because I could take myself way too seriously. And understanding that a lightness of being can actually lift us through some of these more difficult times, a lightness of being. And then finally, I want to close by sharing what I think is actually the most important point here as we move forward into owning, embodying who we were meant to be in the world, in the fullness, without being crippled and chained by these habits that we have developed for survival methods, if you will. And the story is from the Zen tradition. There was a Zen student who came to his master named Bankai and complained, "Master, I have an ungovernable temper. How can I cure it?" he asked. "You have something very strange," replied Bankai. "Let me see what you have." "Well, just now, I can't show it to you," said the student. "Well," the master said, "when can you show it to me?" It arises unexpectedly, replied the student. Then, concluded Bankai, it must not be your true nature. If it were, you could show it to me at any time. You were not born with this. So I invite you to consider, as you reflect on this behavior of yours, this habit, that as you deepen into the awareness of your true nature, which, as we teach here in Unity, is whole, beautiful, perfect, and good, perhaps deepening into the knowing of your true nature, that which is here all the time, it will help you in forgiving yourself, in relinquishing some of the shame or guilt that might be attached to having lived with a certain negative habit for so long, and recognizing that at one profound and deep level, the easiest thing is to be who you are. And we work tirelessly at being and showing up in ways that testify to whom we are not. But as we take time each Sunday, as we do, to rest in the depths of our own being, we allow that truth to emerge more radiantly. We allow that truth to be that which propels and guides us to release those outer things, the things we were not born with, but that we were taught in order to survive and cope. So we were born in magnificence, in original blessing. We were born perfect and whole. And so I invite us now to take a moment as we enter into a time of meditation to steep ourselves in that knowing so deeply that that which is not resonant with it simply wants to move away from us. So let's do that now as we prepare for a time of meditation.